And of course, we're discussing the right that the neighbor would have under certain circumstances to step in and purchase, in other words, to take the field away from the purchaser, the foreign person who came in, distant person who came in to buy land, by reimbursing him whatever he paid for the field. So if I've been living here for many years and you have come from a different neighborhood and you buy the neighboring estate, I could pay you what you paid, and you would have to leave. And the logic would be you're buying a field for planting, for plowing, to growing produce. You can buy it anywhere. For me, there's a very great benefit to have all my fields attached to each other, as we discussed at great length. We then discussed many cases where there are exceptions to the rule of the right of first refusal, where we don't allow the neighbor to the neighbor to evict or to take the field away from the purchaser by reimbursing the purchaser, because we say not always, there are exceptions to the rule. In some cases, it's better, it's more just and more right to allow the purchaser, the distant person, the foreigner, to come in and buy the land. So that's what we discussed in the past. Last week, we also discussed cases where we see maybe it seems to us that maybe there is some, what they call ha'arama, some trickery going around. And that is that the sale is structured in a way to hide that it's a sale, to avoid the triggering of the right of first refusal. For example, instead of writing a document saying it's a sale, you write a document saying that it is a gift. And a gift, the right of first refusal does not apply to a gift. So we said that if the document says it's a gift, but the document also says it's a gift, but the giver of the gift, the original owner, is backing this up with what they call achrayut, with taking responsibility for it. In other words, if the recipient of the gift will lose the field for whatever reason because of bad title, the giver of the gift will give back the giver, the recipient, the value of the field. We say this is not an ordinary gift, this is a sale. It was just written as a gift to hide the fact that it's a sale, not to trigger the right of first refusal. So that was a case, what Talmud calls ha'arama. Ha'arama is a trick. It's not a lie, because at the end of the day, it's not a lie. I say, I'm giving you my field. Do I have to say that you also gave me money in return? It's not a lie, but it's a trick. It's tricky. It's not being honest. And we discussed the ramifications of that case of how do you know how much to reimburse. That was last week. Now, in this week, we have a very interesting case. We have a case where there's a sale that may be constructed to avoid the right of first refusal, but maybe not. It depends on the circumstances. And now the question is, the Talmud gives us this method to figure out, was this indeed just a way to get around the right of first refusal? Here's the scenario. Scenario is that I have a field in the middle of Greenwich, say on Lake Avenue. No, I'm kidding. I have nothing against Lake Avenue. But I have a field in the middle of Greenwich. And I got 4 neighbors. And those 4 neighbors are all sitting, counting their cash, waiting to buy me out. Okay? Then, one day, I sell a portion of my field to a stranger. To my relative, to a stranger, doesn't matter to who. I sell it to my stranger. But I sell a very interesting portion of land. I sell a portion of land that does not allow for the neighbors to intervene and assert their right of first refusal. Why? Because I sell this foreigner, I sell them a piece of the land that they are not neighbors to. What do I mean? I have a field, I sell only the middle of the field. I still maintain a ring around the piece of land that I'm selling. So it turns out that the person I'm selling to is not neighbors with anybody other than me. So the neighbors of my estate on all 4 sides, northwest, east, and south, are not really neighboring the guy that I'm selling to, because I am selling it to the guy who's in the middle. In other words, I'm selling only the middle of my estate. And the people, and basically there's no one, remember, it's not a right of first refusal. The Talmudic term is ben hametzer. You have to be the master of the border. Metzer means border. You have to be bordering the field in order for you to assert the right of first refusal. If you're not bordering the field, you're not a player here, because the whole idea is you should be able to move your plow and be able to move your field from your plow and your animals from one field to the other without having to do anything else. It should be attached. So here, I have 4 neighbors all around me, all want to swallow me up. I sell, in other words, they want to buy me out if I sell. I sell it to a foreigner, but I sell only the middle of the field. So far, at least according to Maimonides, it seems, so far, nobody could stop the sale, because what are they going to say? They're going to say, we're the neighbors. They're not really neighbors. They're not bordering. Okay, that's step number 1, but the case gets more interesting. 6 months later, I sell the remainder of the field, which is next that entire circle around the middle that I sold. I sell it to the same guy. Now, my neighbors say, we want to buy your field because we're neighbors. I say, 1 second. You're neighbors, but I'm also the neighbor to the guy I'm selling to. The guy I'm selling to is in the middle. I can choose to sell to one neighbor. That's okay. If I sell to one neighbor, the other neighbors cannot intervene. If I sell to a foreigner, then all the neighbors could assert their right, and they'll divide the field in 4. But if I want to sell to one neighbor, that's no problem. So here, what I did was, I sell the middle of my field to a foreigner. Nobody can attack him because no one's bordering his field. 6 months later, I sell the remainder. Now the question is, was this a trick? I sell the remainder to who? To the guy in the middle. And I say, he's my neighbor. He's middle of me. He's bordering my land. Now the question is, could the other neighbors stop the sale? Could they say, this is fraud? This is not really, this is just to go around right of first refusal? Or can I keep a straight face and say, no? I say, look, initially I only wanted to sell part of my field. And that's what I sold. And he became my legitimate legitimate neighbor. 6 months later, I had to change of heart. I need more cash. I decided to sell everything else. Is this considered harama? Is this considered a trick? Is this considered fraud? Could the neighbors stop the sale, or could they not? That is the case that we're going to think about today, which is a funny case, entertaining case. That's it. Yeah, that's the case.
Very good one.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if the Talmud says yes. I mean, you cannot do this. You cannot.
Well, I'll tell you what Steve Oster used to say. Whenever you have a Jewish question, the answer is it depends. And you'll always be right. And this is going to be a case in point. It all depends. The question is, what does it depend on? That's the question. But it depends. But it's an interesting case because you see how people get creative. The market is so powerful. You know, the lawyers know. No matter how the legislators try to write a law to get a certain result, there's always pressure to outsmart them because people want to prosper, and it's very hard. And people get very creative, is what I'm trying to say. And when somebody has a financial vested interest, they're probably more creative than the guy writing the law. So here you see, and it's a very interesting case. I would never think of this case, but it's probably a case that happened. Somebody sold the middle of his field. The neighbors had to be quiet. Then he sells then he says the remainder of the field is, I'm selling it to my neighbor. The guy is my neighbor, the guy who I sold to before. Now he's in the center. So what do we do? Is this a scam, or is this legitimate? And the answer
is legitimate. Perfectly legitimate.
Perfectly legitimate.
Well, depends. It depends. I wouldn't.
You're right.
If I were the judge, I would say somebody's trying to play the system. Right. But what's more interesting is that how the right of first refusal originated. It originated from the plowing the field. So whatever is more appropriate to work the land. And then it evolved to all kinds of different.
Correct. But let's assume let's keep it simple. Let's say it's still just plowing the field. So my neighbor wants to plow the fields, but then the guy I sold to the guy in the middle of my field, the foreigner who was some foreigner till 2 months ago, but then I let him in, and that when I let him in, he had to come in. He was able to come in because nobody could stop him because he's not bordering anybody else. But then I turn around and sell the rest of my field to him. Now the other neighbors say, we were gypped. We've been waiting here for decades to buy your land. And it's apparently under certain circumstances, it's the right thing to sell to your neighbor. And here you got creative, but you're just avoiding the law. Okay, so the Talmud's, it depends, is as follows. This is, again, I'm not saying this is the only way to think about it. This is the way the Talmud thinks about it, which is at a minimum creative. Again, it's interesting. I don't know that this is the best. In other words, my argument is not this is the best policy to allow for the marketplace to unfold. But I'm just saying as a question to ask, of figuring out what was the intention. Was this intention for fraud? Or not fraud. Was this intention to avoid this law? Or was this a legitimate intention? And it's very hard to know intention. So you have to look at the action. So here's what the Talmud says. The Talmud says, let's look at the centerpiece that I sold originally. If the centerpiece is of different quality than the surrounding, it's either better or worse, then we assume that it was done legitimately. I first sold one part, the middle part, but the middle part is unique, even though it's all part of one field, but it's unique. It's either better or worse. So then the argument could be made, I decided only to sell the better or the worse. Why? I only decided the better because maybe that guy only wanted the better. Or I only sold the worst because I didn't want to sell the good land. If the middle land is somehow different in any way you could think of, if it's different than the surrounding part of the field, then you would say it's legitimate. But if it's the same exact, there is no differentiation between the middle of the field and the sides of the field, then we say this sale was designed to avoid the right of first refusal. Why? Because otherwise I would just sell a corner. Why am I selling the center? Obviously it's just about to get around this law. So that is what the Talmud is going to say, but you see it's not so simple because it's not exactly clear the scope of the law. We could discuss that what's still unclear, but I think it's still a good point. Maybe we should first take any questions or read the law in Maimonides himself, and then we'll see what questions still remain, because questions do still remain. Okay, so we're looking at number 5, I believe, yes. The following rules apply when a person sells a colleague a small portion of the land in the midst of his field. So I'm selling it to a distant person, not to a neighbor. I'm selling it to a foreigner. But I sell him a small portion of land in the midst of my field. And then sells him a larger portion of land next to the field. In other words, next to the part that I sold you, which ultimately has other neighbors. So now we evaluate the property. If the small portion that he sold him first is of greater or lesser value than the portion of the land he sold him afterwards, the purchaser acquires the desired land and the neighbor cannot displace him. For the purchaser himself is a neighbor by virtue of the small amount of land he purchased in the center. Right? So what is the neighbor going to say? We want to assert the right of first refusal because we're neighbors. The guy I sold to was also the neighbor. Why is he the neighbor? Because previously I sold him land in the center of my field. So now when I sell him land at the border of my field, it's bordering his land in the center of the field. So that's if the center is a little bit better, a little bit worse, or somewhat different, like the commentaries add. However, and now we're going to the second paragraph of 5. If the small portion of land in the center is of the same value as the portion on the side, this is an act of deception. And the neighbor is entitled to displace the purchaser from the second portion of the field that he brought. So it's interesting that Maimonides, others disagree with him, but Maimonides says, and this is what I thought was still unclear, but I didn't realize Maimonides does clarify. Even though we think it's deception, the neighbors can't get rid of this foreigner altogether. They can't stop the sale that was in the center of my land. Right? Maimonides says the neighbors now, if it's deception, in other words, if all the land is the same, so we assume it's deception here, it's just designed to get rid of, to avoid the triggering the right of first refusal, they could stop, see what Maimonides writes. The neighbor is entitled to displace the purchaser from the second portion of the field that he brought. But the first portion of the field that the foreigner bought in the center of my field, where he was not a neighbor with anybody else, that portion of land that guy could keep. It's only what's at stake, according to Maimonides. Others disagree. What's at stake? Other people say you can stop the wholesale. You can get the guy away from the middle as well, because the entire transaction is fraud. Maimonides doesn't say that. Maimonides sort of takes the middle ground. Maimonides is saying that only the second piece of land that I bought, that I sold to that foreigner, only that could be stopped by the neighbors, because the neighbors are bordering that land. But the original land that I sold the guy in the middle of my field, that nobody could stop, because the neighbors, even if you say my intention is to avoid the right of first refusal, it doesn't matter, because no neighbor has a claim to the land in the center of my field, because they are not bordering the land in the center of my field. And like I said, others disagree, but it seems like it's clear that's what Maimonides is saying.
That makes sense, because maybe if the intent was to trick the system, then maybe he doesn't want that land anyway. He doesn't want that center. So if the original intent was...
I got it. Okay.
So
right.
That makes sense. I mean, everything so far makes perfect
sense. But it seems that in this case, the neighbors would want the middle also. The neighbors want the side and want the middle. The foreigner says, I want real estate in Greenwich. I want to keep the middle. But even if the neighbors want it, and the foreigner could assert his right and say, listen, the one in the center I bought, that was legitimate. You were not the neighbor. You were not bordering my land when I purchased it, because I bought it in middle of the field of the other guy who sold it to me. You, Mr. Neighbor, you're not bordering the middle, so you have no claim. You're not at the table. You're not a party at the table here. But if then I go and try to sell after that, like we said, sell the field at the border, the neighbors can take away that second one.
Rabbi, I may be jumping ahead, but how does one determine if it's equal value?
Okay.
Especially since any lot in the middle of a bigger lot without its own access is probably going to have lesser value.
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to that. I remember in the 7th grade what my teacher, the metaphor the teacher brought for us, it doesn't really apply here, but the metaphor was, would you like to have a nice fancy home, small, or a big abandoned building? Now, the price tag for both could be $1 million, right? But one is considered more desirable. But that's not a perfect. Okay, so here's the joke. I'll tell you the joke, and then I'll tell you, and then I'll tell you what I think is the real answer. The joke is that they had a conference for real estate moguls, and everybody gets together, and there's different people, and everyone's introducing their real estate holdings. And there's some rancher in Texas that says, well, I own 20 miles by 20 miles. And the other guy says, I own 50 miles by 50 miles. And everyone's showing off their holdings. And there's one old Jew sitting there, and he says, I own 1 square block. So they look at him, they laugh at him, they say, what's a square block? Like, what are you doing here? You came to the wrong conference. He says, yeah, but the square block I own is in Midtown Manhattan. So, right, so you can own less land that is more desirable. I think it's not. I don't think that's exactly the answer. I think the answer is that we're talking about. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know. We're talking about land that is more fertile. In other words, the way they valued real estate for the field, right? We're not talking about homes. Homes, again, it's a question whether this entire law applies to homes. We mentioned that in the past. It's a debate. The Code of Law says yes, but Maimonides probably says no. We don't know for sure. But let's assume we're talking about just fields. So in the farming world, it was very clear how fertile is this land. And they could look at the same field and say, yes, your field is a wonderful field, but the corner is rocky and it's stone and it's not as fertile as the land in the center. And then when the Talmud says, Idit and Ziburit, better land or worse land, the Talmud is talking about how fertile the land is. So it's the same value. In other words, you could still get $100 of produce from the good and from the bad. But from the good, it's still somewhat easier. And I know that the modern economics disagrees with it. I think has trouble with the notion, because modern economics wants to translate everything and put a dollar value on everything. And if I tell you that one land is more fertile and one land is less fertile, but they both can produce $100 worth of vegetables, but one will be beautiful vegetables, less, and one would be many more vegetables that are not so beautiful. So the modern economics, I think, would argue they're both worth $100. It's both the same, right? That's how the modern economics thinks about it, yeah. But that's not the way the farmer thinks about it, right? The farmer thinks about it differently. For him, raising crops is also a work of art, and he wants a beautiful vegetable. It's not only how much can the vegetable sell for, right? Assuming I have two pieces of land, one land would get me 10 tomatoes, and I sell each one. I sell each one for $10, or the other land will get me 100 tomatoes and I sell each one for $1, right? So I'm getting the same $100. The question is, in Talmudic, in the world of the farmer, they're still considered one is better and one is worse, and there's a distinction there. Okay, now I want to say one more thing. Again, if I'm not convincing, I'm not trying to change the subject, but I want to say one more thing. In the Talmud, the concept of better land and worse land is common. In other words, this is how people thought about land. There's the same land, could be more fertile, less fertile. One's called Edit, one's called is the best, one called Ziburit, one is called the worst, and one is called Beinonit, intermediary. Why is this important? So let's say I owe 3 people money, and I have one field. But in the field, there are different parts of the field. And one field is considered better, as defined, however exactly we define it, but let's assume one is better, one's worse, one is intermediary. They're both worth $100, but one is a very small piece of land, very desirable in downtown Greenwich, and one is 100 miles up, and there you can have a whole estate, much bigger land, but it's not as desirable. Now you're going to ask how they both worth $100? I don't know. I'm not an economist, but let's assume that's the case. So there's a very interesting distinction that it depends on what type of debt I have. That would determine who gets to collect the better land. Okay, so if you think about it, let's say the Torah says clearly that if I owe money to you because laws of torts, because I caused damage to you, my ox gored your ox, I owe you $100. I also owe Vicky $100 because she was kind enough to lend me $100. Okay, so Vicky's my creditor. She owes me money because of a loan. I owe money because I harmed you. And then it could be, not in my case, but it could be you have to pay a ketubah. Okay, you divorce your wife, you have to pay her. She's entitled to money from your estate. So how do you divide who gets the better? So we know for sure the Torah says that in the case of my ox goring your ox, in other words, in the laws of torts, the Torah says, Meitav Sadeu, Meitav Karma Yishalem, you will pay from the best of the vineyard and from the best of the field. So that is a biblical verse. That verse is, if I owe you money because I damaged you, and then you come to collect and I have no cash, so you're going to collect money from my real property, I can't tell you, oh, take my land, the land that's less desirable. You have the right to take the most desirable land. That is the biblical commandment. Okay? Now, what happens, Vicky? Vicky, I owe her money. What land should we give Vicky? So here it becomes very interesting. Biblically speaking, I can give her the worst land. Where does that come from in the Bible? So we once discussed this many years ago. I think Vicky was there many years ago. We once discussed that there's a law in the Torah that says that you're not allowed to enter, the creditor is not allowed to enter the home of the creditor is not allowed to enter the home of the person who borrowed money to extract payments. Not only the creditor can't, but the court agent cannot. The court agent or the creditor have to wait outside, and the person who owes the money will bring out the payments. We want to protect the dignity of the borrower. We want to protect the privacy. Just because the guy owes you money, you can't enter his home. That's the law. It's biblical commandment. In the portion of Teitzei, we read it 2 weeks ago. we had this whole discussion of what are the ramifications of the law and how does it apply today, and there's all kinds of exciting laws about that. Maimonides talks about it at great length, but that's the principle. Says the Talmud, if Vicky comes to my house, okay, and in my house I can give her I owe her $100. I can give her I owe her $10,000. I can give her my beautiful ring, a diamond ring, or I can give her a truckload full of Q-tips. Same amount. It's the same amount of money. It's worth the same. What am I going to give her? Am I going to give her, if I have the right? If she cannot enter my house or she doesn't know what I have to bring it to the door. Says the Talmud, what will somebody bring to the door? Somebody's going to bring to the door. Somebody will bring the worst material. So the law is the creditor, biblically speaking, the creditor gets the worst. However, the Talmud realizes that if you make it too difficult for the creditor, there's going to be a credit freeze. Vicky will never lend me money if she knows that if I can't pay back, then instead of getting the diamond ring, she's going to get a truckload full of Q-tips. And basically, you're not helping the borrower by giving too much, making it too hard for the creditor. Because if you do, the creditor is not going to loan money. And like the Talmud says, this is the phrase of the Talmud for a credit freeze. The Talmud uses it in all kinds of contexts. We're very careful not to make it too hard, not to discourage loaning. So the phrase the Talmud uses for a credit freeze is, you should not lock the door in the face of the borrower. I'll knock on Vicky's door, she's going to slam the door in my face if it's too hard for her to get repaid. So therefore, even though biblically speaking, the creditor will take the worst land, the sage say it's not going to work. We're going to up it one. And the law is that the Baal Chayv, the creditor, will take intermediary material, intermediary land. The damager, if I damage somebody, I pay him the best. He has the right to take the best. If I borrowed money, even though biblically speaking, he should be getting the worst, nevertheless, we want to encourage loaning. So we up the deal, and the borrower could take the middle quality. And then it becomes very interesting. If I owe money to a woman because of the ketubah, because marriage obligation, and he got divorced, or I died, and the estate has to pay the woman, then I know it doesn't sound romantic, the woman gets the worst. Why does the woman get the worst? It's not we have anything against women, because the woman is then considered a regular creditor. Now, for most creditors, we move them up to the intermediary because we want to encourage loaning. But that reason does not apply to the marriage, right? Saying that the woman will be able to collect a ketubah from the intermediary is not going to make more people want to get married. In other words, it doesn't fall into that category. So therefore, we go back to the original biblical law, which is the creditor always will take the worst. So if I have an estate and I owe 3 people, I owe Andy money because my animal gored his animal. I owe Vicky money because she loaned me $1,000. And I owe a woman money, not me, somebody would owe a woman money because of a ketubah. So the nizak, the one who was damaged, will take the best. The one who I owe money to because I borrowed money to will take the intermediary, and the woman would take the ketubah, collecting the ketubah, the woman or her heirs, doesn't matter, would take the worst. All I'm telling you is that in the world of agriculture, people understood that any land could be broken down to, if I had a choice, if you have a big piece of land that's worth $1,000 and I'm only entitled for 200, it makes a difference where I get my 200. Right? If I can only take a portion of my field, I don't want the portion that has the stones. I don't want the portion that's not as fertile. I want to get the portion that's more fertile, even though you're going to say, we're going to give you $200. If we give it to you in the better part, we'll give you a smaller land. If we give it in the worst part, we'll give you a bigger land. I still want smaller and better, even though they're both worth $100. Okay, so like I said, you can buy 50 acres up in nothing against upstate New York, up in Sullivan County. You could buy 50 acres for $1 million, same $1 million. Or you can buy a little house here in Millbank Avenue for $1 million. One is considered better, one's considered worse, even though they're both worth $1 million. Right? So in the same thing, think about the same thing in terms of agriculture. So it's just a long way of saying, I have no idea. I don't know the answer to your question because I'm not a farmer. That's just a long way of answering you, Andy. But the point here is, all I'm trying to say is, in the Talmud, in these tractates of the torts, of the Nezikin, of the gates of damages, it's established. In other words, even before Talmud, like I said, going back to biblical law, it says clearly, Meitam Sadeu in some cases have to pay back the best. So we understand even in one piece of land, there'll be best, there'll be intermediary, there'll be worst. It could be they're all the same, but it could be in the same portion of land, there'll be differences. Why am I saying this? Going back to this law. If when I sold land to the foreigner and I sold him land in the middle, not bordering anybody, if when I sold to him, if the middle land that I sold is somehow unique to the surrounding land, either better or worse, then we say it's legitimate. I didn't sell it to you so that later I could sell you the rest of the field, avoiding the law of the right of first refusal. No, I sold it to you because I was only willing to sell the land that is worse, or you were only willing to buy the land that was better. In other words, if the middle is different and unique, and again, the commentaries explain, it doesn't have to mean better, or as long as there's some distinction. If I could make an argument, if I could walk into court and say, the land that I sold this foreigner is different than the surrounding land, and that's why I sold it to him, because I only wanted to sell that land, or he only wanted to buy that land, then later, if I sell the rest of the land, it's considered legitimate, because it's logical that you would sell it in two portions. But if it's exactly the same, nobody can find any difference between the middle and the surrounding land, then we say, listen, this is just a nice way of getting around the neighbors, and the neighbors have the right to take back not all of the land, not the land that I sold in the center, according to Maimonides, but the second land that I'm selling after that. They say, hey, we're going to assert our right, and we get that land as well. So that is just a little bit about one section. I think it's already, we'll do one more, which is easy. Later on, the chapter gets a little harder. So we need to have our fresh mind at 10 o'clock, not already at 10:40 when we're all already tired down. So we'll keep that for next week, but we'll do one more law. And the law is a fairly logical law. And that is that right of first refusal is only triggered when and Andy would like this law because Andy's a lawyer. The right of first refusal would only come into effect when the sale is final. If the sale is not final, the law is not triggered. What is the ramification? If I sell you my land and I say, I'm selling it to you on condition that at my 80th birthday, you'll show up to my birthday party. That's the condition. And I sell you the land, you give me $1 million, I give you my land, there's a condition, stipulation. It only works if Andy will come to my 80th birthday party. That is legally considered a sale that is not complete. Why is it not complete? Because all conditions have not been met yet. So even though the transfer of money and the transfer of land already happened, but if you don't come to my 80th birthday, I give you back the $1 million and I get back my land. So the sale is not complete. If the sale is not complete, the neighbors cannot assert the right of first refusal because the sale has not yet been complete. Now, if you're a lawyer and you like this law, because you can do all kinds of interesting tricks with this law, I'll give you more information if you pay me my legal fee. No, I'm kidding. You see, you can get creative on this, but let's read it inside and let's see what he's saying here. So let's go. Number 6. When a person sells a property within the context of a conditional agreement, whether the condition was stipulated by the seller or the purchaser, a neighbor cannot displace the purchaser until all the conditions are met and the purchaser acquires the property entirely without the original owner retaining any connection to it. Only then may the neighbor displace him. So I can think of a scenario where you don't live here, you live in Australia, you want to come into Greenwich, I sell you my land, I get the money. The neighbors cannot bother us. Why not? Because you say, I'm very sorry, even though it looks like I moved in here and I did move in here and the transaction has happened and it's all transparent. I gave Andy the money. It looks complete from one perspective, but no, because there's a few stipulations that are involved, which means the stipulation means that if the stipulation is not met, the seller could reverse the sale. In other words, not a reverse, it's not really a sale. Right? If the stipulation is not met, I will at any point give you back the money and you'll give me back my field. Oh, so the seller did not sell it yet. He didn't move out. He didn't leave. He didn't leave the land yet. And therefore the neighbors can't come and say, we want it because it still belongs to the original owner, even though he's only connected with one little small thread, but that thread still connects him to the land. Right? Think about it. If the neighbors step in, think about it this way. If the neighbors step in and evict Andy, How am I going to know that Andy's going to come to my 80th birthday? Right? The neighbors can't guarantee that for me. So that's why, that's the logic. The logic is I'm still connected to the land. My ownership of the land is still asserted in the fact that this was leverage for Andy to come to my birthday party. And therefore, you could be living on a land for 100 years, and the stipulation can be that my grandkids will come to my grandkids' wedding, right? You can look at all kinds of stipulations, but the bottom line is it's not considered, the right of first refusal is not triggered unless the sale is final. And if the sale is not final, the neighbors cannot complain, even if the money has been transferred and the land has been transferred, but it's not sealed because there are still stipulations. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short, and this will give you all day to think of scenarios where you get creative and buy a piece of land, sell a piece of land, and protect yourself from the neighbors. Okay, that's the story in short. Comments, questions, jokes, disagreements?
Is there any process to rescind the sale on the day after your 80th birthday?
Yes. So at that point, the neighbors can complain. The neighbors could assert their right the morning after my 80th birthday. Not on my 90th birthday. We'll see later. You have a small window where neighbors can complain. It's not like the neighbors can come 10 years after the sale is final and say, oh, we're asserting the right of first refusal. They have a very small window because we don't want to make it too hard for the seller. Otherwise, no land will sell. For the buyer, otherwise, no land will sell. But assuming, but they could, yes, theoretically, as soon as this sale has been concluded, has been formalized in the sense that there are no longer any stipulations, the morning after my 80th birthday, the neighbor can come to court. Now, it's smart for me to make a sale if I'm trying to avoid the law, because it's not clear that my neighbor will have cash then, right? You have to understand that we'll see it later. We want to make it, for the neighbor to assert the right of first refusal, he has to walk into the court with cash, right? He can't start saying, I'm asserting my right of first refusal, and I want to evict the purchaser, but I'm going to pay the purchaser back in 90 days when I get a loan from my bank. It doesn't work that way. You have to get rid of the purchaser. You have to come with cash, and you have to come immediately. Because again, if we make it too difficult, if we make it too easy to get rid of the purchaser, then no one's going to want to purchase land. So we have that balance. So it's possible that I know you're sitting on cash right now. So remember, back in the olden days, it wasn't so easy to get cash the way it is today, right? Today, you just go to ATM, you get cash, you get to pull out your cash from the bank. But back then, your assets were in real property. You didn't want to put everything in your mattress. So I could know that, well, maybe today you have cash, maybe in 2 years from now you don't have cash, and you won't be able to assert your right of first refusal. So it makes sense for me to make a stipulation to delay it for 2 years and try my luck. But the answer is, you're right. The answer is that the moment the sale becomes final, because the moment there are no longer any stipulations, the neighbors, at that point, that's when the neighbors can complain, could assert their rights, and evict the purchaser if they meet the conditions, which is they come immediately and they come with cash, and that's, yeah. And there are a few others, but that's the big idea.
Yeah, that opens the whole bucket of possibilities. I'm just wondering how Talmud will go untangle on all that, and you cannot think of all possible scenarios.
That's why that's why we have judges and lawyers, and we don't have lawyers. That's how we have judges. In other words, we have to evaluate each case. But again, the idea here is that a person has a legitimate right. The seller has a legitimate right. I'm selling you land, right? I have a right to use that land in any way I want. And part of it is to make the stipulation. And I have a right, forget about the right of first refusal. Anytime I sell anything, I can make a stipulation. I can make a stipulation that I'm selling you the land on condition that every year on my anniversary, you send me flowers. That's my stipulation. I have the right to use my land for any purpose I want. That's a legitimate purpose. So therefore, if you're going to tell me that the neighbors could step in before the stipulation takes effect, you're robbing the seller from using his land for the rights that he's able to get from that land. And that we don't do. Because remember that the right of first refusal is not allowed to affect the seller negatively. If it affects the seller negatively, we say it doesn't work. It only works if the seller is not affected. And we say to the buyer, what do you care? Buy here, buy there, it's all the same, right? So if you're going to tell me that I can stipulate Because I'm going to tell Andy, you're coming from Australia. I'm going to sell you my land so that you can come to my 80th birthday. Meanwhile, the neighbor is going to come evict Andy. Andy will have the right not to come to my birthday. Oy. So you're robbing me, the seller, of the usage of a legitimate usage of my land to create stipulation.
I guess we have to come in 2 weeks just to hear all the possible solutions.
That's why we have it. That's why the judges, the lawyers always win. In other words, that's why every case, if it's challenged, you have to evaluate the case based on the principles. But you're right, you cannot spell out every principle, you cannot spell out every scenario.
So we're gonna meet in 2 weeks.
Next week is Tuesday. What's next week? Next week is Rosh Hashanah, right? Oy vey.
Right.
After Teshuvah, I got to do some repentance. Okay, fine. Yeah, God willing, we'll meet in 2 weeks. Yom Kippur is what? Wednesday or Wednesday night? We'll look at the calendar here. I don't think we should meet the day before, it's too close. But look, God willing, in good health, we're going to meet again. I don't know, next week or the week after, but we're going to meet again. But we can't leave this alone here.
Yeah.
Okay, so next Tuesday is Rosh Hashanah. Next Tuesday is 8th of Tishrei. Yes, we can meet on the 14th, which is the day before, 2 days before Yom Kippur. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you. Looking forward to continuing.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Andy, for joining. Thank you, Zina. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Paul.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.